All right, let's talk about a legend. Today, we're diving into the mystery of Bigfoot, but maybe not in the way you'd expect. We're not going on a monster hunt. Instead, we're running a fascinating scientific thought experiment. We're going to use real biology to see if we can build a plausible blueprint for this creature.
So let's just ask the big question right up front. What if this creature was actually real? Not a myth, not some paranormal being, but a living, breathing animal that has to follow the same rules of nature as everything else. What would it actually take for it to exist?
Look, we're going to set aside all the blurry photos and the spooky campfire stories for a minute. Science lets us ask a much more interesting question. What would the bare minimum requirements be for a giant, undiscovered primate to actually survive in our modern world? We're basically putting the legend through a scientific gauntlet.
Now, to do this, we're not just pulling ideas out of thin air. We're going to build a biological blueprint. And we're basing our hypothetical creature on what we already know about its closest living relatives, the great apes.
So here are the ground rules for our little thought experiment. First, we're assuming this is a real flesh-and-blood animal. Our analysis is going to be based on comparative primatology, looking at gorillas and orangutans, and the hard science of how animals use energy and what it takes to maintain a healthy population. And just to be clear, we are setting aside any paranormal stuff to focus strictly on the biology.
Let's start with the first and maybe the biggest challenge: food. An animal of this size is basically a giant biological engine, and that engine needs a massive amount of fuel every single day. To really get a sense of scale, let's do a quick comparison. On the left, you've got the mountain gorilla, the biggest living primate we know of. On the right is our hypothetical primate, which, to fit the stories, would have to be a bit bigger. Let's say around 250 kilograms or 550 pounds. That extra size has huge consequences for its energy needs.
And what's the price tag for being that big? Well, based on what we know about animal metabolism, a primate that size would need to chow down on about 11,250 calories every single day. And that's not to pack on weight. That's just the basic cost of walking around, staying warm, and, surviving. Its entire life would just be a constant, relentless search for food.
So, how on earth does it find all those calories? Well, the smartest survival strategy wouldn't be to be a picky eater. It would have to be an omnivorous generalist, kind of like a grizzly bear. The diet would have to be super flexible, mostly plants for sure, but with a critical amount of animal protein, from things like fish, bugs, or maybe scavenging. That flexibility is the only way it could survive the changing seasons.
Okay, so it needs a ton of food. That brings us to our next big question. Where could it possibly find all that food and stay hidden? I can tell you right now, not just any old forest is going to cut it. The requirements for its home are incredibly specific.
And here's the kicker. You need all of these things in the same place. You need thick, old forests for cover. You need year-round water. You need rugged, mountainous terrain to stay isolated. And maybe most important of all, you need an extremely low number of people around, all inside a vast, unbroken wilderness. Every single one of these is non-negotiable if you're a giant creature trying to stay undiscovered.
So you take that checklist and you start looking at a map of the world, and honestly, one location just pops right out as the most likely candidate: the Pacific Northwest of North America. It's got the huge forests, the rugged mountains, the water, and massive roadless wilderness areas that could, theoretically, support an animal like this.
But this is where the biological gauntlet gets really, really hard. Because survival isn't about just one lonely individual hiding out in the woods. For a species to actually exist, you need a population. And that brings us to what might be the single greatest hurdle of all.
Let me introduce you to a critical concept from conservation biology. It's called the minimum viable population, or MVP. This isn't just, a few animals hanging out. It's the absolute smallest number you need to prevent the gene pool from collapsing due to inbreeding and to have a realistic shot at surviving for the long haul.
So what's the magic number? For a large, slow-reproducing mammal like the one we're imagining, scientists estimate that the minimum viable population would be somewhere around 2,500 individuals. Anything less, and the species is on a slippery slope to extinction. So we're not looking for one creature. We're looking for thousands of them. And a population of 2,500 giants? Well, they need a gigantic home. If you calculate the home range they'd need, you end up with a staggering number. that population would require up to 400,000 square kilometers of uninterrupted, high-quality habitat. To put that number into perspective for you, that's an area roughly the size of the entire state of Washington. A hidden population would need to occupy a protected, resource-rich wilderness that massive just to survive. The scale we're talking about is just immense.
So the biological requirements are steep, to say the least. They're really pushing the limits of what seems plausible. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, they were out there. How would science actually find them? Forget the monster hunting shows. Let's look at the real, modern, scientific toolkit.
A real search would be systematic and super high-tech. First, you'd use mapping software to zero in on the highest probability zones that meet all those habitat needs. Then you'd flood those areas with long-term camera traps and audio recorders. But the real game changer is step 3, hunting for environmental DNA, or eDNA. This is a revolutionary technique. By taking water samples from rivers and streams, you can find the genetic fingerprints, skin cells, hair, whatever, of any species living upstream, even if you never actually see it. So, what's the final verdict from a biological perspective? Well, this quote from the research paper sums it up perfectly. The requirements for survival, the calories, the habitat, the population numbers, are incredibly stringent. They really do push the limits of plausibility. But they are not, strictly speaking, biologically impossible.
And this brings us right back to that huge nagging mystery. If the biology is at least possible, and we have all these amazing scientific tools that can find even the most elusive species, then where is the definitive, undeniable proof? From a purely scientific standpoint, the fact that we still don't have a body, or clear DNA, or undisputed high-res video, it really only leaves us with one of 3 logical possibilities. And here they are. First, and the most straightforward, the creature simply doesn't exist because those massive biological hurdles we just went over are, in reality, just too great to overcome. Second, it does exist, but the population is so critically small and spread out, way below that viable minimum, that finding it is like finding a needle in a continent-sized haystack. And then there's the third, and maybe the most fascinating possibility, that it does exist and it possesses a level of intelligence and elusiveness so advanced that it can actively and successfully avoid all of our attempts to find it. And with that, the science leaves us right back where we started, staring into a great mystery.